The Boy from Yesterday, Chapter 11, The Tunnel of Wind. Tom's eyes adjusted to the daylight as he left the front gate of Zeller's house and stumbled his way up the street on his way to the general store, passing a woman he had never seen before, who wore an elegant black dress with long gray hair tied up in a bun. He instinctively turned back and found the woman watching him, expressionless, before turning back and almost stepping on a stray black cat who darted out of his way with a screech. It wasn't far to walk, but it took him a little while to get his bearings, with his heart pounding in his chest. He felt drunk on adrenaline, and his feet moved fast through the blocks to the store. As they came into the front door of the store, two children were leaving, blocking the door for a moment, which annoyed Tom. He was eager to get inside and tell Uncle Nate what had transpired, but he stopped quickly when he saw Minerva Butts, the town gossip, chatting with Uncle Nate from in front of the counter. She was all done up in her finery, with ribbons and plumes on her hat that she wore over her abundant strawberry blonde hair tied up in a bun. Tom wondered how long she would stay, but she was, as usual, prattling on to Uncle Nate, who stood behind the counter in his apron, putting some merchandise into cubbyholes and shelves, unpacking the latest shipment of salves, tonics, and cure-alls. "That's like dear Maud's husband. Well, Mrs. Blankenship, you know, she was in a terrible way when he got back from Kansas City. He was so thin, I noticed. And I've just been over at Miss Beckon's house and spoke to one of her hands there. Cyrus, I think his name was. I just want to wish him the best. I know poor Sam is in an awful way," she said, as if Uncle Nate didn't know all this already from others who had been in the store earlier. Tom didn't say anything as he went behind the counter on the other side of the store and put his apron on, but he was listening closely to what Mrs. Butts was saying. He started unloading the back-ordered shipment of coffee from Columbia and some china dolls from some crates behind the counter that he knew Uncle Nate had left for him. His ears perked up when he heard Mrs. Butts starting to talk about Sam. "Poor Sarah, that's Miss Beckons, looks so pitiful and pale. They say she just sits quietly, poor soul, and that Sam has his good moments and bad ones trying to recover. The fever worries them so, I expect. That can be so trying," as she shook her head and looked at the ground, twirling with the strings of her purse and pouting her lip a bit. Suddenly she looked back up and her eyes brightened. "Oh, and a pound of flour, if you would, please, Nathan. I'd like to bake a pie for Sarah. She must eat something there. I don't know if her help knows its way in a kitchen. Dr. Hurd is there, of course, doing his best, but you know I wouldn't want to bet my spring crop on Dr. Hurd. But he did help with the twins, to be sure, born so small and all. But he's in an awful way, Sam, that is. Everyone knows about that blasted horse, you know, tossing him over like a skipping stone, but he's awful sick. Something about his leg. I declare, I just can't imagine. I don't think Sarah could manage if it came to pass that Sam—" She was about to continue when the sight of Tom on the ladder. "Well, Tom, how are you, dear?" she said, giving a little wave of her gloved hand, then leaning over the counter and saying back to Uncle Nate in hushed tones that Tom could still hear, "How is he these days, Nathan? You know this is 5 years now? Well, since his poor parents passed, he's so big now, I just think that there's something else up in there on that ladder. But he's a fine man now. Poor soul, it's so tragic." Tom couldn't stand it any more. As he put up the last of the jars on a high shelf from the top rung of the ladder, he saw the ring on his hand as he reached above his head. He couldn't wait any longer, and he knew what he had to do. He climbed down a few rungs on the ladder and then just skipped the others by jumping down to the floor. He whipped off his apron and tossed it on the counter and leapt toward the doorway to the back storeroom. "Say, Uncle Nate," he said over to his shoulder as he made his way into the back room, stopping only to spin the combination to open the wall safe and put some cash in his pocket from the petty cash jar inside. "I'm off to see about Sam." "Fine, son," Uncle Nate replied as he finished assembling Miss Butt's order and began loading some new books on the shelves of a beautifully carved wood cabinet with a big carved eagle at the top of it. "When are you back?" "Couldn't say for sure, but I have an errand or so to run," Tom said, popping his head back through the doorway and tipping his hat in the general direction of Minerva. "Miss Butts," he said, turning back to the storeroom and making his way out the back door. The back door slammed shut as he walked out into the sunny, grassy field behind the store, behind Main Street. He stood in the shade beneath a huge maple tree on the lot and stopped. He looked at his pocket watch. 12:14 p.m. He then took the little scroll out of his pocket that Zeller had given him. It was lightweight and slippery, and he dropped it on the ground. He picked it up and gently unrolled its stiff papyrus to read it. It had all kinds of black squiggles written in ink at the top of it, which was in some language Tom didn't understand. But as he unrolled it, English words were written in a different ink, a light blue, in a beautiful hand. His heart was racing as he was trying to think of what the little scroll had to do with the magic ring, or how it was going to work, but Zeller had said something about it having magic from the faker of wherever that would work. Tom was desperate after all he had seen and heard, and had no time to waste. He unrolled the scroll farther and tilted the paper toward a patch of sunlight that shone between the branches of the tree to read it. One will point the fingers to the face and rotate the ring clockwise in one full revolution. Stand upon the left foot and say, Epi, Pepi, Kaki. Tom did this, trying to maintain his balance and hold the scroll at the same time. As he did, he felt a small vibration from the ring, which at first he thought was his imagination, but as he kept still, he knew he felt something. He continued to read the scroll. Rotate the ring again clockwise one revolution, then stand upon the right foot and say, Hillo, hollow, hello. He did this too, again finding his balance, feeling quite foolish. He looked around to see if anyone saw him, but there was no one there. He felt the vibration stronger now and thought he could almost hear a humming sound in his ear, however faint. He lowered his fingers a bit and saw the front of the ring. The jewel in the ring, which used to be dark red, now pulsated a faint red glow, which at first he thought was the sun reflecting off the ring as the branches swayed in the breeze and let the sunlight through. Then he held his hand in a spot inside the shade, but could still see the faint red glow. He stared at the dragon's eye, a little red jewel, and jumped a bit when the eye flashed brightly, a quick fraction of a second, all while still feeling the vibrations. Tom took a deep breath before the last part, planting both feet firmly on the ground. He looked around him a moment at the field, at the beautiful maple tree, at the passers-by in the distance, hearing some calls and greetings to one another, hearing the horses clop by in the street in front of the store, and seeing Uncle Nate's house and barn down the street, with the old barn's weather vane on top, missing its E, but swinging a bit in the breeze. It seemed to swing faster as the wind rustled through the branches of the trees. He caught the light enough to read the last lines of the scroll. Rotate the ring a third time and stand on both feet and say, Zizzy, Zuzzy, Zick. No sooner had Tom said the last words than the breeze suddenly became a huge gust of wind, seemingly knocking him out because his whole world went black. Then he realized he wasn't asleep at all, but wide awake, a cold breeze blowing against him as if he felt like he was moving quickly through a wide, dark tunnel, like a train tunnel, with only a faint light at the end. He managed to grab onto his cap and shove it in his pants pocket as the wind seemed to rush past him in gusts in the blackness, the constant cool wind blowing against his eyes and making them tear up and blur. He could only hear the roaring of the wind in his ears, but as he continued to soar through the tunnel, the wind subsided a bit, and he heard the sound of a tinkling piano in his ears. The piano played a fast tune like you might hear from a saloon. He opened his eyes in the blackness, and dim light appeared off in the distance, like a big sign painted on the side of a building, but it glowed, like he was looking in through a window from the outside. He squinted his eyes and tried to see the window-like square. It looked like a newspaper headline, and said in big black letters, King Kalakaua dead, Liliuokalani assumes throne. Tom didn't know what that sign meant, but then another came floating by in the tunnel, another direction, and another, but he was only able to briefly glimpse the images of the letters. There were dozens of them now as the piano music continued in his ears. Letters, headlines, and images raced past him as he continued to soar through the blackness. Grover Cleveland elected, said one. Then another, a black translucent picture with the soft, faint outline of a skeleton's torso. Then an image of 3 black men hanging from the neck from the long branch of a tree. Utah, 45th state. Plague kills thousands in China. Then a bright white flash of light popped in Tom's face. Then as it passed, he saw more images. McKinley assassinated. The bones of a huge creature formed a skeleton with long, sharp teeth. As he saw these, the music in his ears from the piano faded, and a different type of sound came through. It was the sound of musical instruments, again playing a very fast tune in a way he had never heard before. A fast, zippy song in a style he didn't know. He saw a phonograph cylinder float by, but as he gazed at it, it flattened into a dark black plate and continued to sail past. A book floated by, a thin one, with its pages flapping in the wind, but instead of words, each page had boxes of pictures on it. He saw the ghost-like image of a woman passing by, and as she did, he was amazed as her long, full dress suddenly shortened and revealed her legs from the knees down, as her hair became unpinned, flowed through the air, and then shrank to a shorter length, bouncing about the sides of her head, and she winked as she sailed past. He tried to turn his body to see her, but she was gone. Only the sweet smell of a perfume lingered in the constant breeze. In the distance, a horse and buggy went by, floating in the blackness, when suddenly the horses disappeared, and the buggy lengthened, its roof came off, and a man and woman sat inside the open buggy, the woman holding her hat as they giggled, and a long scarf extended from the brim of her hat, blowing in the wind. A man wearing a helmet with a big thick spike on top of it, and some sort of dark uniform, floated by, but seemed to march in the air as he did so, followed by another just like him, and another, until there was a roar of thundering feet rushing by like a cattle stampede. Tom covered his head with his hands. The music was a chorus of men singing the words of a march. Over there, send the word, over there. The thundering feet continued to march by, but as he looked up, the look of the men had changed. He saw they all wore armbands, and he didn't recognize the insignia, which was a red band with a white circle and a twisted black X in the center of it. He looked another direction, and in the distance saw a man with short black hair and a short, square mustache pounding and pounding on a podium, apparently making a speech, sounding angry and perverse, but speaking a language Tom didn't understand. He saw windows that showed beautiful women glowing in the light, in the most extraordinary gowns that Tom had never seen before. He saw another of a little girl in a blue dress, wearing sparkling red shoes, walking in a colorful little village surrounded by tiny people in funny hats. He saw another city, something like the old days of Chesterfield, but it was burning, and a woman in an old green dress, like the ladies wore when Tom was little, was walking down the middle of the street as hundreds of men in uniforms lay in the street. He recognized these as Civil War uniforms, and he breathed a quick relief in seeing something he recognized. And yet the woman walking wore garish makeup and didn't look anything like the way he remembered women looking back when he was little, just after the war. Next he saw a gray-haired man at a podium. He spoke with conviction. "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." The image morphed a bit, and the man was suddenly a bit thinner and older, but he continued talking at the same podium. "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy." He was startled as he saw a bluebird fly past, but as he saw the bird, the wings spread out, and the bird wasn't a bird anymore, but a giant bird contraption made of metal, with a man seated inside wearing a brown leather cap and big goggles. The bird machine had a spinning propeller like from a ship in front of it, and a long white scarf around his neck blowing through the air in a trail behind him. The contraption sailed by, making an awful roar of a noise like a thunderbolt, as the pilot waved and saluted Tom as he zipped by. Tom saw the plane fly off in the distance, but as it got smaller and smaller, it suddenly burst into the biggest ball of fire Tom had ever seen, a huge billowing flame that looked like a mushroom made of fire and smoke, growing in the sky. He saw a young man in a sailor uniform walking down a busy street, smiling broadly, take a woman next to him and dip her backwards and kiss her right there in the street, crowded full of people. The strange vehicle with no horses morphed into a larger contraption, and the man and woman inside changed too. The man suddenly had slick black hair and was nearly undressed in a white undershirt, and the woman had long hair pulled back in a little scarf. There was a huge roar like thunder as the contraption seemed to float by, and music emanated from the contraption as Tom heard a male voice sing, 1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. Tom saw buildings in the distance as if he were flying over Chesterfield, But then the buildings suddenly grew up like weeds, many times their original height. Another flying contraption went by, not like the one before, but that was open and the pilot waved, but this one was enclosed and looked like a steel bird with wings and square black eyes, and making a roar louder than any train Tom had ever heard. A young man in a tight gray suit playing a guitar sailed by as the music he heard changed again. The young man's voice sang, "I wanna hold your hand." As the man floated by, he held up his hand and extended 2 fingers in a greeting at Tom as a thin cigarette burned from his lips, and the acrid smoke burned Tom's eyes as he breathed the air passing by. A group of women's voices then sang in his ears, "Baby love, my baby love, I need you, oh how I need you." Tom saw a man at a podium again, not like the one before, but a young, handsome man with short brown hair standing saying, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." He sailed by and was gone, only for Tom to see a tiny little boy standing still, but still floating by, in a little suit, and saluting Tom as he went by, frozen like a statue, as he heard a woman he couldn't see crying in the distance. His eye tried to focus on a figure like a man in a diving suit, like he saw in an illustrated edition of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea when he was a boy. Only this time the suit was all white, with a white helmet with an orange face cover. The little figure seemed to bounce a bit on air when he walked on a dusty terrain. Tom heard a faint voice say, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Tom didn't know what that meant, and before he could look away again, the figure was gone. Tom felt a chill in the air and turned his body in space and suddenly saw the hideous face of a little girl with straggly brown hair. Her face was pale white, but with wrinkles and scars, and with horrifying yellow eyes staring at him. She wore a dirty white nightgown and seemed to be tied down to a big wooden post bed like a wild animal. She snarled a hideous smile of rotting teeth. She looked like she was about to say something, when suddenly she gushed a projectile of thick green vomit from her mouth. Tom ducked and turned away from it in the dark space, but then it was gone. He saw nothing for a moment, then heard a man's deep voice saying, "I will resign the presidency as of noon tomorrow." When he looked up again, his eyes were dazzled by the light coming from the spinning mirrored ball, as the sound of rhythmic music surrounded him, with flashing colored lights shining all around him. He turned another way and saw a young man with an extremely thin, gaunt face, lying in a hospital bed, who looked up at him helplessly as he passed by. Tom noticed the man had big purple spots on his face, and the man's mouth hung open as Tom looked at his pleading, deep brown eyes. The music in Tom's ears changed again, with many drums and strange sounds Tom had never heard before, and a woman was singing loudly, "It's raining men, hallelujah, it's raining men, amen." Tom turned to see another man with a pleasant face, a big knobby nose, and curly gray hair, looking at someone else and waving his finger as he said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." And Tom startled at what he heard, for he knew he heard it clearly. The music changed again as he heard, "So tonight we're gonna party like it's 1999, and the wind became stronger and a rush of air past his ears became louder. He saw in the distance another man at a podium, this time a Negro man wearing a suit, and Tom had never seen a Negro in a suit at a podium before. He had a shaven face and big ears, but a broad smile, and the roar of an applauding crowd seemed to surround him as he smiled and waved. A woman's voice sang in his ear a song with a strong beat. "If you like it, then you should have put a ring on it. If you like it, then you should have put a ring on it." Soaring through the blackness, he heard all kinds of music, voices, bells, buzzers, and noises of all kinds coming at once. He heard a male voice sing, "Now you're just somebody that I used to know," in a rhythm of drums and violins, and a female voice sing, "And this is crazy, but here's my number, so call me maybe." Tom felt faint as he hurtled through the tunnel. He heard another voice sing, "We're up all night to get lucky." He decelerated drastically in the blackness, but still seemed to be traveling fast, when the light suddenly became bright, and he hit his body hard as if he had been pushed from behind and slammed against a wall lined with small, square pink ceramic tile. He hit his head on the wall, which hurt, but he was stopped. He hit the wall so hard that in addition to the bang of his forehead, his shoulder also hit the wall. Dazed, he slumped to the ground on cold, hard, white tile. He found himself in a small room with bright light that smelled stale and odorous like an outhouse. It was bright and it was harsh. He heard a buzz that seemed to come from electric lights in the ceiling above his head from long white panels. His eyes adjusted to the harsh light. He noticed little stalls across the floor where he was seated, with doors on them. Inside each stall he saw a ceramic toilet. He was in some kind of indoor outhouse with indoor plumbing. He looked another direction and saw 3 small sinks installed against the pink tile walls. He stood up, head throbbing, and rubbed his forehead. He noticed the ring on his finger, but he wasn't holding the scroll anymore. He felt all his pockets, but it was nowhere to be found. He looked around him on the floor, but it was missing from there too. His heart raced as he realized that the scroll with the words that made him fly through the dark tunnel was missing. Without that, how could he use the ring again? He felt trapped in the little room. His panic rose in him, looking all around the room and tried to find any sign of the scroll, looking in every one of the little toilet stalls. He came out of one and suddenly heard the loud squeak of a door to the room opening. An older woman, looking like someone from Tom's town in a long dress, carrying a cloth with purse strings and a bonnet that looked old and out of style to Tom's eye, saw Tom and shrieked, a gloved hand to her face. "Eek! Young man, you can't be in here. This is the ladies' room. Get out of here before I call a cop, you peeping Tom." Tom didn't understand why the woman was shrieking or how she knew his name, but her face was so flush red with anger and her eyes so dilated in fear that Tom feared the ring had sent him through a tunnel to somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. So he remained silent except to affix his cap on his head, bow, and give a, "I beg your pardon, ma'am," as he made his way quickly to and out the door. No sooner had he left the little room's door than he found himself outdoors. He was standing on a big field of hard black rock covering the ground, just coming out of a little building. There were bright electric lights all around, even though it was still daylight. He glanced inside the little building and realized it was some kind of general store. A big firm canopy covered the field outside the little store, and big metal boxes with windows stood a ways off in front of the big boxes that connected long black hoses to the big metal boxes. There was a chemical smell in the air that was not altogether unpleasant, but still smelled like chemicals. One of the big metal boxes suddenly made a roar of a noise like a machine. Tom watched it as it suddenly started moving on its own. It was like a carriage that was drawn by invisible horses. He looked as the big metal box had a person inside it, like a carriage that turned a wheel inside that seemed to control the carriage, turning it in a direction toward the street that was covered in the same black sheet of rock that he was standing on. There was a din of noise in the air from the other contraption carriages around. Some of them blasted a noise that hurt Tom's ears. Apparently, if one of the carriages with no horses came close to another. He stood against the wall of the building that had the little store, trying not to be noticed by anyone, when a man dressed in ragged pants and a ragged coat walked by, looking at Tom and saying, "Hey man, nice costume for C-Day, dude. Spare a quarter for me to get something to eat?" Tom said nothing to the man, afraid to speak. The man looked at him, then moved away by simply saying, "Whatever, man." Tom saw the most odd collection of people going out of the store entrance. Tom couldn't believe what he was seeing. Some of the people looked and dressed like Tom, with similar hats and pants and shirts, and some women in long dresses. But then other women looked like they were still half-dressed, or dressed like men in shirts and trousers. He tried to figure out what the ring had done. It must have sent him through outer space to another planet where carriages moved with invisible horses and the creatures were some kind of combination of men and women, but something else entirely. Where could he be? He tried to determine as his head throbbed in pain. He reached up and felt a little cut on his forehead, wet. He looked at his hand and saw a little bit of blood on the tips of his fingers. He decided he needed to ask for help, but the Raggedy Man was already gone. At least the people on this planet spoke English, Tom realized from the Ragged Man, even though Tom didn't quite understand him. Where could this be? Tom thought. He gathered his courage and decided to go into the little store, avoiding the eyes of anyone who was nearby. Merchandise and bottles, boxes, and little clear plastic bags were everywhere. Even though he didn't know what the products were, he knew from experience that they were goods for sale, and he had arranged displays many times at the general store. There were candies and bottles of nuts, which he recognized as such. He then noticed a rack of magazines and newspapers. Big black letters on one said, "Chesterfield Sentinel. Historic drought has U.S. West fearing the worst." Tom looked closer at the front page. Sunday, April 20th, 2020. Tom's eyes welled up with both relief and horror as he realized that what the ring had done had not sent him to a question of where. It was when.